Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. We're excited to have you here tonight to kick off our Spring 2023 webinar series. My name is Ed Pritchard, and I work for Miami EcoAdventures. We're a unit of the Miami-Dade Parks Department. This webinar series is a joint effort between my organization, UF IFAS Extension, and Florida Sea Grant. We host this webinar series every second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. And we have a wonderful lineup of talks scheduled for you guys this spring. So we hope that you're able to register for that same link that you used to register for tonight's presentation. A few housekeeping items before we go ahead and get started. Everyone in this webinar is currently muted, and we ask you guys to stay that way until the end. Please keep your videos off as well. If you have any questions, we definitely would like to hear them. Please type them in the chat box. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be moderating that chat box, myself and my colleague Anna. We'll answer those questions with a Q&A period at the end of tonight's presentation. This webinar series is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out within the next week. So please share this with others that you think might enjoy. You can also follow us on social media for similar content at Miami EcoAdventures and at Miami-Dade Sea Grant. If you want to receive an email reminder with the monthly conservation topic and the registration link, please email Anna. She's going to go ahead and put her email address in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to tonight's speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Eric King. Eric, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you all of you who are here tonight joining us. I hope everybody can hear me. We good there? Just want to make sure.
Sounds good, Eric.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to kick it right off. My camera is not on, but I do feel it's important. You should put a face to the name. So let's just start off with that. There I am. Yes, my name is Eric King. I am the interpretive program supervisor at Castello Hammock Nature Center and Preserve down there in Redland, Florida. Castello Hammock is kind of the interpretive hub of the Redland area, and we're just lucky enough to have a nature center situated in the historic neighborhood there. So we talk a lot about Redland. As you can see in this picture, I'm also an avid vegetable gardener. I'm look a little sleepy in that photo right there, but I'm always impressed with the amount of leafy greens that are around me. It's really my happy place. I'm also a musician, producer, folk music, as well as orchestral music. And I really, really love Cheez-Its. So there, now you know me. I love Cheez-Its. So let's get on with the presentation today, shall we? So when I talked to Ed initially about doing this program, I gave him this really shock value title, The Ruins of Orchid Jungle. But really what we're talking about tonight is Hattie Bower Hammock Preserve, which just happens to be the ruins of Orchid Jungle. And it's pretty important to me that we include both those names because three eras, of this property's history all fall within that one title. Hattie Bower Hammock, Orchid Jungle, and then eventually Hattie Bower Hammock Preserve. So we're going to be talking about that today. If you guys would just excuse me for one moment. Just getting something situated here. The fire alarm at the building that I'm at decided to go off right before we started this presentation. So there we go. Okay, so moving on. Before we really get into the ruins of Orchid Jungle, of course, I do want to give you a little bit of a history of the site that we're going to be talking about tonight. Hattie Bower Hammock Preserve, as we know it today, is located just south of Southwest 264th Street and 152nd Avenue in Redland, Florida. That's pretty significant. That's Bauer Drive, if any of you are familiar with the area. And the reason why that's significant is because there was a woman named Harriet Bower who actually owned that property for several years before it became Orchid Jungle. And Harriet Bower was actually one of the very first women in South Dade to settle land. She was able to do this through an act of Congress called the Homestead Act of 1862, where you could pretty much go to an open public piece of land and stake your claim there, and you would file a small filing fee, and you were granted that land, which happened to be 160 acres. So it wasn't just like a little dinky old area, oh, you get an acre. This was 160 acres of land that you would get. There were a few stipulations, one of which being that over the course of 5 years, you would have to build a homestead. And then the other stipulation was that you would have to grow some sort of citrus, grow some sort of crop. So in South Dade, it was citrus, and many other places in the United States that were open to settlement. It was different types of vegetables and that sort of thing. But down there in South Dade, it was citrus. And South Dade didn't open up to homesteading until 1898. So this was a really interesting culmination of things that were happening in South Dade at that point in time. One being the opening up of settlement, but also the fact that just 2 years before, the FEC Railway had reached what would become downtown Miami. And Flagler, the person funding this railroad, always had this intention of going to Key West. But originally, he was going to plow through the Everglades to do that. There's a flowery story, literally flowery story about Julia Tuttle sending Flagler these orange blossoms, and he was like, Eureka, and it convinced him to build his railroad to downtown Miami. That's not exactly how it happened. There was a lot of land, deals and whatnot going on there. But either way, the long story short is that in order to get to the Keys, you had to go through Homestead. So the railroad was going through Homestead around 1898. That's when land was opened up for settlement, and you had all these pioneer families coming down into the area and settling land. So one of those families was the Bauer family, Frank E. Bauer and his wife, Hannah, who had a few children, a couple daughters, and one of them being Harriet. Harriet very quickly, at the age of 33, settled her own land, which was about 160 acres right across the street from her parents. She built a very small cottage, 10 by 16. The one that's shown in the photo here, we don't know if that's her cottage. What I will say is that the photo above on the top right is a picture of Hattie Bower's hammock, and that's what it became named, Hattie Bower's hammock. And the picture below was taken right around the same time. And a little bit of trivia for y'all: these photos were taken by renowned early naturalist John Kunkel Small in 1916. So Harriet had a very small, humble abode, where she was growing citrus, growing avocados, and she really kind of liked that life. She would spend half of the year living on her property, living at her home, kind of a solitary life. And then for the other half of the year, she would work as a seamstress in downtown Miami. She always had this want, this desire to help people. So in 1919, she actually followed behind her sister Martha and became a nurse. And very shortly after that, she founded the Holloman Park Sanatorium, which is around the Brickell area. It's not there any longer. And decided that, well, she was spending so much time in that area now that she would finally sell off portions of her land. So she began doing that very quickly. And in 1922, she sold 25 acres of that land to a man by the name of Finel. After she sold off all her parcels, she opened up a nursing home where she continued to work until her death in 1961. But even up until that age, she continuously worked in charity. Like I said, she always had that want to help people, especially in conjunction with the Holy Cross Episcopal Church. So there's Hattie Bower, your pioneer woman. So our other character here in our story is Lee the Wizard Finel. Lee the Wizard Finel. He was called the Wizard because he was one of the few people who knew the secrets of growing orchids from seed. And he would do this in small glass Coca-Cola bottles, in fact. And this was kind of a deeply held secret amongst a few growers. In Cynthiana, Kentucky, he had a very successful cut flower business, orchid growing business, which always perplexes me when I think about someone growing this exotic flower in Kentucky, where it's incredibly cold during the winter, and they would do so in these burrowed pits that they called rose pits. As time progressed and the greenhouse became a thing, he did have enough money to build greenhouses with boilers that would heat his plants. Unfortunately, due to some really poor city planning, in 1921, he lost hundreds of his prize orchids when a flood flooded his greenhouse boilers and damaged them, and all his orchids froze because of that. So one of the things I love about history is that there's often multiple stories that lead to the same place. And in Lee's case, there was a story about him getting sick and his doctors recommending that he go down to sunny South Florida, where it's humid and it's hot and it's good for your lungs. And this was a really common prognosis that people would get. They would be sent down to sunny South Florida if they had tuberculosis. That was really common. And then there's another story that said that he did this in Mexico. And while he was in Mexico, he picked up more orchids. Regardless, his illness and his want to grow orchids in a natural space drove him and his family to purchase 25 acres of land from a woman by the name of Harriet Bauer in Redland, Florida, and he moved his family there in 1922. Very quickly, Lee built a cottage out of limestone, which was really common post 1920s. That's what people were really building their homes out of in the Redland area. Before that, it was more like wooden shiplap. He built a greenhouse and he built several displays. One of the most important things, and this would kind of set the stage for what would become Orchid Jungle, was that he carved a trail through Hattie Bower's hammock where he placed orchids in trees. He was a big fan of Charles Torrey Simpson, who wrote a book in 1916 about gardening, native gardening in Florida, but adding exotic flair. So bringing in exotic plants to make a more jungle aesthetic. And this was very commonly used by Charles Deering, for instance. Both Charles and James Deering, the Commodore Ralph Monroe took some notes from that. And actually some popular attractions like Simpson Park in the city of Miami, the Monkey Jungle, the Parrot Jungle, which is now Pinecrest Gardens, and of course, Orchid Jungle. Now, we're not exactly sure when Orchid Jungle officially became Orchid Jungle. We know it was the mid-1920s, and we know that by 1926, Finel had over 2,000 commercially viable plants. So very quickly, he was building up his business. And there were 30 varieties of these plants. And just a little note, 10 to 12 of those varieties were actually hybridized varieties by Finel. So he wasn't really intending initially to be a roadside attraction. He just wanted to sell orchids. But you think that during this time, this was the birth of the automobile. So people were driving around and looking for things like this to do. So I mentioned Monkey Jungle and Parrot Jungle and some other roadside attractions like the Coral Castle. Orchid Jungle was actually the first of all of these. Monkey Jungle opened in 1935, Parrot Jungle 1936, the Coral Castle in 1938. So it was really quick that visitors in their vehicles were noticing that there was this site where you could walk a trail and you could see beautiful orchids in a native habitat. But it still wasn't quite that roadside attraction yet. In fact, it didn't really happen until 1926. There was an article written in the Miami-Dade News about Lee Finel's Orchid Jungle. That was the title of the article. And the next day, thousands of people showed up to their site to see what they called the Orchid Jungle. And another little bit of trivia for you all, that article was written by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who was a young reporter at the time. So now you had Orchid Jungle operating as an attraction, and it wound up that 4 generations of the Finel family operated the site from the mid-1920s to the mid-1990s, all kind of putting their mark on it, with their different gifts and talents. So now we have, there's your 4 generations there. So you have Lee and Mary, initially Thomas Sr. with Dorothy, Thomas Jr. and Trudy, and then Thomas Jr. and Trudy's 3 children, Thomas III, Anita, and Trudy Lynn. The orchid that you see there, and that's Dorothy Finel, the orchid that you see there was given the scientific name Dendrobium Dorothy Finel, and that was a hybrid that Thomas Sr. created. When it bloomed, it was 5 feet tall, 7 feet wide, with over 1,000 blooms. It took 11 years for it to mature and flower. And unfortunately, it matured and flowered 2 years after Thomas Sr. had passed away. But the person that it was named after definitely got to enjoy it. All right, so we have a little bit of history there, kind of getting you up to speed about what this place is. So let's get to the ruins, because as I mentioned before, Orchid Jungle is in ruins now. What I want to do with you all is kind of take you through the site as if we were visitors to the Orchid Jungle. So I'm going to show you a series of photographs of how things look now, and hopefully how they looked in their heyday. And I say hopefully because I don't have photo. It's surprisingly hard to find photos of Orchid Jungle when it was really popping, so to speak. So let's get on with it. So right off the bat, we have the Finel Cottage, and this was the very first structure that was built on the property. It was built in 1922, and I mentioned before it has that masonry work of the oolitic limestone that gets quarried from right below, the ground beneath. I always find it interesting when you see chimneys on old houses, because a lot of these folks, I mean, the Bauer family, for instance, was from New York. The Finel family is from Kentucky, so it's kind of just part of construction to put a chimney on your home. Also, they could build smudge fires that would help with mosquitoes and that sort of thing. But you see, this is how the Finel Cottage looks today. And this is one of those sites where I just do not have any photos of it when it was in use. Though we know that it was in use at least until Hurricane Andrew, and we have met people who actually lived in it after the Finels moved out. So that's actually kind of to the side, because I want to say that the Finel Cottage wasn't actually part of the Orchid Jungle. It was adjacent to the Orchid Jungle, but here's where the Orchid Jungle actually starts. So if you are to drive down 157th, and I want to correct myself, I said 152nd Avenue earlier. It is 157th Avenue. That's Newton Road. If you are to drive down 157th Avenue, just south of Bauer Drive, 264th Street, you we'll see the remnants of orchid jungle just to the east of 157th, very short distance from 264th. And almost immediately, you'll notice that there is a limestone pylon that is outside of Hattie Bower Hammock Preserve. This is the pylon that once held the entrance sign of Orchid Jungle, where they had this large, at one point, wooden orchid that literally hung into 157th Avenue. And then as time progressed, I believe the title screen I showed the metal version. They had various versions over the years, but all that's left of that entrance sign is that pylon. But if you get a good look, there's actually a crank where you had a cable that went through those large wooden beams that held the orchid, and at one point in time, the orchid actually spun around. So this is where you would park your cars. You could see at the top right, that's a photo from the late 60s, early 70s of the Orchid Jungle entrance. Now that parking lot is all filled in with grass and a lot more trees and whatnot. But if you were to park there, you would be faced almost immediately with the main entrance and gift shop to Orchid Jungle. What you see in that main photograph there is the burned out pergola that had a corrugated plastic roof that kind of overhung the patio area there. And then the bottom right is a photo of how the gift shop looks now. The top right, of course, is how it looked then. And if you kind of align the photos a little bit, you'll see the 4x4 post in both the top right and bottom right photos, and the oak tree that was behind it. So that can kind of orient you to what you're actually looking at there. So this gift shop was operated by the kids, Anita and Trudy, up until the point where Orchid Jungle officially closed. And when you walk through here, you'd pay for your ticket and you would immediately enter into what they would call the jungle landscape. One of the first things you would see is a little kiosk stand that had a map showcasing different types of orchids and where they're from and where you could actually see them within Orchid Jungle itself. Beyond that, you have the remnants of the office buildings there. And I really love this because still to this day, there are desks and filing cabinets and wires and whatnot, melted telephones. And I'm sure you're kind of getting an idea already of what happened to these structures. And then just below that very handsome arm right there is holding a piece of incredibly thick corrugated glass that literally has chicken wire mesh with inside of it. And this was glass that was placed on the windows of the offices and also on the Finel cottage. The fun little fact about this glass is that Lee Finel harvested it from the Richmond Naval Base once it shut down. And for those of you who don't know, the Richmond Naval Base is the Richmond Tract, which is adjacent to the zoo Miami, and that is an imperiled pineland habitat that you have over there. So you find this really thick glass kind of laying on the ground all over the place. And then you have the labs. The labs were something that they were installed by Tom Finel Jr. And this was really when the family was trying to have more credibility in the scientific community for their abilities to produce orchids with tissue cultures and, of course, to grow orchids from seed. So what you see here in this main photo are the remnants of the labs. It is a condemned building. And then the two photos on the right of how it would look like if you were a visitor there. You literally had people in white lab coats that you would view outside of a window, very theme park, as they worked on the orchids there. Okay, moving on. As you pass the labs, you keep on going past the offices and whatnot, you enter what's called the Vanda House. And this is probably one of my favorite structures on the entire property, where you have these shelves of concrete that are on either side of you, where they would display different types of orchids and bromeliads. There were beautiful waterfalls inside this building, a huge ventilation system, which you can see on the bottom right there. There's a large fan. It's really, honestly, post-apocalyptic looking now, but absolutely beautiful in its heyday. That photo on the top right, I think even when we originally started doing this presentation, I didn't have that photo. I only got it just recently, and I was so happy because I didn't have a photo of the Vanda House in its heyday. At that point. One of the things I love about going into the Vanda House is because still to this day, there are plant tabs on the ground. These are little tabs to identify which orchid you're looking at with its scientific name. And they say Finel's Orchid Jungle on them. And many of them have the phone number without the area code. So for those us who are old enough to remember, we didn't have the 305 or the 786 at one point in time, even when I was a child. So and upon exiting the Vanda House, you start to really enter into what was Hattie Bower's hammock. This is the more natural area. As soon as you exit the Vanda House to your south, would be your right. You see another one of the earliest structures on the property, grandfather's greenhouse. That limestone rock is probably 3.5, 4 feet tall, and then it has a gabled metal roof, just the frame of it now. And it's just a really beautiful structure. It's incredibly difficult to get inside of it because the entrance is butted up right against the Vanda House. But if you are able to get inside, you would see large metal tables that are propped up on limestone pillars. And really, whenever you see the limestone, it's indicative of these being original structures on the property. Just fabulous stuff. Okay. So now you're entering into the hammock, the natural preserve at Hattie Bower, and it's really something else because you are now seeing massive oak trees that have great age to them. There's beautiful vines, most of which are exotic, but they're hanging from the canopy, and it's just really a wonder to see when you enter into it. There's a section of the trail, and it happens to be one of the most beautiful sections, in my opinion, called the Vista of the Seven Oaks. And in here, you have these large oak trees that were used to display orchids. And this was really, Lee Finel's intention. His first intention with the property was to have these massive trees. Oak trees work out really well for orchids because of that really textured bark that the roots of the orchids could really sink themselves into. And this oak here is lovingly called Grandfather's Oak. I should mention that Grandfather's Oak, Grandfather's Greenhouse, these were things that were named after Lee passed away in 1941 in honor of him. So, this is why it got that name. But Grandfather's Oak is believed to be over 500 years old there. And pictures just really don't do it justice, because when you see it in person, you see massive roots that cascade over the rocky hammock terrain. And there's just really a sight to behold. All the mosses and rare ferns that are growing on them and whatnot. So, and here you are with Hattie Bower Hammock. And this really gives you a great idea of what you would see today. That 4x4 post was put there by the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program for some interpretive signage. There's actually also corrugated pipe post as well that the Finel families put in. They're still there to this day. But that photo gives you a really good idea of what you would see today. The top right is a photo by John Kunkel Small. And it is of an oak tree. You see many bromeliads bursting out from it, probably some native orchids in there as well. And it looks very similar to grandfather's oak, but I don't want to say that with certainty. And then that bottom right photo is what you would experience as a visitor to Orchid Jungle. And you really get a sense of the pops of color and why this place was so attractive to so many people. And I think this is a good time to talk about hammocks. It always comes back to conservation with these conversations. Hattie Bower hammock is what we call a rockland hammock. And this is a globally imperiled ecosystem that is found along the rises in elevation on the Miami Rock Ridge, which is that half moon shape finger glades and whatnot coming from Biscayne Bay all the way down into the Everglades. And because of those elevations, not only is the topography change, but also the types of plants that are able to grow in those different areas. They are very commonly bordered by pine rocklands, more globally imperiled than the rockland hammocks. And the pine rocklands usually fall on slightly lower elevations than the hammocks. It's very similar though. And you can see in the photo that I have there, that is an aerial from 1938 of Orchid Jungle. And you can clearly see to the north, a lot of farmland. Redland very quickly became an agricultural district where a lot of pineland was removed. And then you can see where you have a pine rockland and many of the trees, are really sparse in there. So you can clearly see the delineation between the pine rockland and the rockland hammock there. Rockland hammocks are known for large canopy trees. They're very shady. Large canopy trees such as strangler fig, malimbo, wild tamarinds, live oaks, etc. And they often contain massive solution holes in them. There's these holes that are created in the limestone that can sometimes be anywhere from 10 to 13 feet deep. And so because you have those solution holes, you have many rare and state-listed endangered ferns that can only grow within the microclimate that is contained within those solution holes. So more on that in just a moment. Inside solution holes, you often find archaeological sites. The most famous solution hole in South Florida is the Cutler Fossil Site, located at the Deering Estate, where they found the bones of saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, different types of camels, and also the bones of indigenous people that lived here 10,000 years ago. In fact, the Cutler Fossil Site has an old hearth where they would cook underneath. So it's very common to find artifacts and bones and whatnot inside these solution holes. Here at Hattie Bower, their solution hole is bordered by a railing, which once again, I love it. It gives that theme park aesthetic that you're looking at an actual attraction. And that top right photo is another by John Kunkel Small of a limestone sink, as he called it, within Hattie Bower hammock. And then the photo below is me attempting to lose my phone forever by lifting it on a selfie stick above the solution hole. Now, historically, these solution holes would be sources of fresh water when our water table was higher. Now that our water table is lower, they're usually just muddy. But when you have large storms, like the storm that canceled our original date for this conservation conversation, they do fill up with water. So you can imagine these were great places for early indigenous people and, of course, animals to find sources of fresh water. I liken them to like cenotes in the Yucatan, in fact. Some other cool features about Hattie Bower hammock. That handsome fellow right there is standing on what's called Mount Dade. This is the highest point above sea level south of Coral Gables. It's 19 feet above sea level right there. And my coworker who took the photo did some really creative photography to make it look like I'm actually standing on a mountain, but it's really not that high. Of course, sometimes when I walk it, I could feel the air, getting thinner, and I'm losing my breath a little bit. That top right is a Colacordifolia tree, which was grown by the Finel family from seed. This is a tree that is native to Africa, and the Finels grew it by seed there. The tree is massive. So when I say it was grown by seed, you can kind of, bat your eyes at that, but when you actually see the scale of the tree, it's really impressive. And then I mentioned briefly the corrugated pipe, not corrugated, excuse me, the galvanized pipe that are sticking out of the ground, and these were original signs that were put there by the Finel family. There's one there talking about lancewood and how it's related to the avocado. So just a really cool site altogether. Okay. Sometime during the course of this conversation, the fire alarm went off, and it's it's much more pleasant in here. So I guess we need to talk about the end of the orchid jungle. What happened. So in the 1980s, there was definitely a decline in popularity of not just orchid jungle, but the roadside attraction altogether. You think in the 1970s, the mouse came to town. Disney was built. So that became, that kind of overshadowed a lot of these old roadside attractions, though Orchid Jungle did operate as an orchid sales place. In fact, at that time, the name Finel was synonymous with orchid growing. But they were hurting a little bit. And one of the final straws, of course, and this is the Redland story, this is the Homestead story, this is the Florida City story, was 1992, August of 1992, South Dade gets hit by Hurricane Andrew, which makes landfall as a Category 5 and pretty much obliterates the area, including Orchid Jungle. Both the photos on this slide are from the aftermath of Orchid Jungle. But the family persevered, and this was really led by Anita. She wanted to get things reopened, and they did. They briefly reopened with an arts and like a harvest festival, arts and craft fair in 1993. And I talked a little bit about how history, you have different stories. So I don't know what happened first here, whether Orchid Jungle closed first permanently, or whether or not Thomas Jr. and Trudy Finel won the Florida lottery. But both of those happened in 1994. And at that point, I think they just cut their losses and they moved on with their lives. They won $6.7 million in the Florida lottery. Thomas Jr. and Trudy, they took that in yearly sums, did a lot of traveling with it, and gave the majority of it to charities, especially charities regarding children's services. So it's almost like they were taking the helm of Harriet in their own way there. The family also starts to begin to get offers from developers that want to develop the land, probably build some sort of condominiums or something there. And they reject every single offer they get, except for the one that they get from Miami-Dade County, who promises to keep the property intact as it is. And they're able to purchase the property through the new Environmentally Endangered Lands Program and a grant from the Florida Communities Trust. So in 1998, 15 acres of Hattie Bower Hammock Preserve get purchased, and it is reopened in 1999. That same exact year, it is designated as a historic site by Dade County. And now you have a passive park where the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program installs interpretive signage up and down throughout the trail, and you could actually walk right on in and observe, look at these buildings. Unfortunately, about 15, 16 years later, 2 acts of arson are pretty much the nail in the coffin, and the site has been closed ever since to the public. And this really is due to the safety concerns, where you do have structures that are burned out, collapsed, and it's just in certain areas unsafe to walk unless you're being guided. So that's where I come in. So, right now the site is being managed by EEL. We have a great preserve manager who really cares about the site. And you have Miami EcoAdventures, who's running interpretive programming out of the site. That's me. I run a Hattie Bower hammock preserve walk, a guided walk of the site that you can do 1 to 2 times a month. And also as I've told Anna and Ed, I've been touring this presentation to different areas, just so that there's more awareness about this beautiful resource that we have. So, this begs the question, what's next? What happens to Hattie Bower now? Well, one of the things I can tell you is that nature is reclaiming the site. The vines are taking over. The structures are being covered in different shrubbery and different mosses, and there's ferns, and it's just really overgrown, which I think some people would say good. There are continued EEL volunteer work days, so you can sign up to work, do a volunteer work day there and actually work at the site, pulling some of those exotic philodendron vines and whatnot. Continued interpretive programming, of course, just like we're doing tonight. And then I'd like to mention that there was a historic structures report done by an architectural company in 2020, so really recently. And they made several recommendations on the site, and none of this is, set in stone. So we don't know exactly if this is the direction that they're going to go with this. But these are the recommendations that were made, and they're kind of hopeful. So one is the restoration of the Finel cottage. And it amazes me, the oldest structure on the property is still sound enough to be restored and used. What would be removed, and I failed to mention this before, there was an extension that was added on to the Finel cottage in the 1960s. That's in terrible condition, and that would be removed. The preservation of grandfather's greenhouse, the second oldest structure on the property, will be kept. It's in that good of condition. It was mentioned that the metal framing for the old roof structure would have to be removed, but the walls, they're great. The Vanda House, my favorite structure on the property, stays. Their recommendation is that it stays. It's in good enough condition to remain. And that good old sign pylon, because why not? And then it also recommends the removal of certain structures that are in disrepair, like the labs, the offices, which essentially aren't there. It's just burned out ruins. There's a roof literally on the ground. And the historic entrance, that pergola and the old gift shops that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. Their recommendation is to reopen the park with park amenities, perhaps a campfire circle. I think saying anything fire involving Hattie Bower is makes me nervous, but a campfire circle, maybe a shelter, maybe a rustic camping site for scout groups and that sort of thing. And this always, brings up the question for me when I talk about this is, what is the level of preservation versus access that we should have at these sites? Should we just open it up as a passive park again for people to just walk around and potentially vandalize? Or should we let nature reclaim the site as it's doing and just let it be? So I'd be interested to hear your opinions once we go into the Q&A section of this program here. I do want to share my references, and that's the photo of one of their beautiful brochures. Every lady gets an orchid, and when you went to Orchid Jungle, every lady got an orchid. And here's my references, and all these references are available online except for the Finel family photo albums that I was provided by the Environmentally Endangered Lands program, and I thank them profusely for that because it just gives so much more insight into the history of this really interesting family. All right. So thank you all so much. I do want to end the presentation with a question. Here it is, one last thing. It is the only question we're going to ask you, and that is to please indicate, I guess it's not really a question, but indicate your level of agreement with the following statement. I learned something from participating in this webinar. Do you strongly agree that you learned a lot? Do you just agree that you learned something? Or do you disagree where you totally didn't learn a single thing at all? And I think we're going to give you all a minute to do that. All right. Looks like everybody's good. Well, that makes me happy. Thank you all so much. So I'd like to thank you all so very much for joining me today. If you have any questions, there's my email address. It's really easy. I have one of the most generic names in existence. It's eric.king@miamidade.gov. Please email me. I love to answer questions. And I'm also here to answer your questions now. So yeah, how does that work, guys?
That's great, Eric. Thanks so much. Such an interesting site and history, and definitely want to go out there and visit that with you. So we'll go ahead now, and it's 6:50, 6:45. So if you have to leave, that's totally fine, but we're going to stay on, and I already have some questions here in the chat. But if you have any more, please go ahead and put them in now, and we'll go ahead and start with those. So I'm going to start